along with partnered events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything that we have confirmed, please visit our website, politics-prose.com. So before we get started today, I would like you to ask you to please silence your cell phones just to avoid any disruptions during the event. When we get to the time for opening the floor to your questions, we have a standing microphone over here by this large pillar. Please speak into the mic clearly so that everyone can hear your question, and we want that question to be heard in our recording of tonight's event, which you can find on our website. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing line up here at this big table. So if you haven't already purchased the book, we have plenty of copies behind our registers at the front of the store. We'll ask you to line up starting at that same pillar behind the mic, and then we'll come by to ask your name for personalizations. So please have your books out and ready for us. And once the event is complete, we ask that you please fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy just to help us clean up a bit. So now, without further ado, tonight I'm very excited to welcome Jillian Medoff, celebrating the release of When We Were Bright and Beautiful. Medoff is the author of the national bestseller I Couldn't Love You More, as well as the novels Good Girls Gone Bad and Hunger Point. A former fellow at MacDowell, Blue Mountain Center, VCCA, and Fundación Valparaiso, she has an MFA from NYU. In addition to writing fiction, Jillian has a long career in management consulting and is currently a senior consultant at the Segal Group, where she advises clients on all aspects of the employee experience. Medoff will be joined in conversation with Jung Yun, author of Oh Beautiful and Shelter. Her work has appeared in Tin House, The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, among others. Currently, she lives in Baltimore and serves as an assistant professor of English at GW. She also serves on the boards of directors at the Faulkner Foundation and the Alan Cheuse Center for International Writers. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose Jillian Medoff and Jung Yun.
Thank you so much, Alicia. All right, that's you. This is me. And I didn't realize the chairs were so high. Hi, everyone. Hi. Hello. Oh, goodness. I'm going to slip. So, hello. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so excited to talk with my friend Jillian about her amazing new novel. We were talking back in the green room about how it's very new, so we don't expect that people have read it yet. And it's a really hard book to talk about without spoiling things, so we're going to work our way around this as carefully as we can because I don't want to take any of that thrill or that experience away from folks. Jillian, I am going to start with the question that I dread, but I have to ask if you could tell us a little bit about what When We Were Bright and Beautiful is about.
I would love to. First, I want to thank Politics and Prose for hosting us. We love indie bookstores, and thank you for doing this with me, and thank you all for coming, and thank you everyone who's online. If you have questions, feel free to text them or email them in. But I will tell you a little bit about the book. It's a family drama, and when we were first putting together the strategy for marketing, I said to my editor, well, it's kind of a legal thriller. And she's like, no, it's a family drama. And she said, and I said, no, well, you know, it's a suspenseful mystery. And she said, no, it's a family drama. And I said, but it's a thriller. And she said, no, it's a family drama. So my background as a novelist is in family dramas. And so this is about a family, a very, very wealthy family. And they live on the Upper East Side. And the son is accused of rape. In the very first paragraph, you find this out. And his sister, Cassie, who is telling the story, she comes home from Yale, where she's in grad school, and she is adamant, and the family is adamant that he's innocent, and they're going to defend him at all cost. And then over the course of the book, there are several reveals, and I really wanted to write a book where you read and then you get to a reveal and then you realize that everything that came before it, you're now looking at it through a different lens. So by the time you finish the book, you realize it's a different novel than the one that you started. And so there's a big courtroom scene, I guess part. There's a big courtroom trial. And it really is about privilege and complicity and agency and all of the very important issues that we're struggling with today.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a great start. So I'm always really fascinated by what writers, particularly novelists, start a project thinking that they're writing about, and then the book that they eventually end up writing. So I was curious if you would be willing to share the origin story of this book, what you thought you were writing, and how and why it evolved over time.
Sure, that's a good question, because I started this book, I have a regular job. So I work 4 days a week, and I write on Fridays, but I also write sort of in the margins. And it takes me a long time to write a book. And we were just talking about, I was at an event last night with Megan Miranda and Jamie Brenner, and they write like a book a year. And I am just in awe of people like that, because it takes me forever. So I actually started this book in 2014, was the first, when I wrote the first scene. And the book was originally about the building, the landmark luxury building, the Valmont. And it started as an upstairs downstairs kind of where it kicked off with a crime, and then you looked at how the uber wealthy, what they thought about the crime, and then the staff who served them, and I sort of started looking at all of the different interrelationships. And the crime was a kidnapping. And in the very first scene, a little girl is in a town car, and she's being ferried off, and she waves to the doorman. And he's watching her, and he realizes, he starts to wave goodbye, and then he realizes that she's not waving goodbye, she's signaling for help. And that's how that started. And I think the idea of a modern upstairs, downstairs, or Downton Abbey is a really good idea. But it was something I couldn't really follow through. I wasn't that interested in the whole landscape of all the different people, so I winnowed it down. It's now one family. The 6-year-old girl is now 23, and her mother is an heiress, and that she still has the same mother, but it's a completely different story. And I changed the crime from kidnapping to sexual assault. And so I worked on that for a couple of years, and then Me Too just exploded. And I was like, oh, do I really want to continue with this? Not because I wasn't really engaged in the book and committed to it, but at that point, I knew it was going to take me another 2 or 3 years, at least, to finish. And then who knew how long it would take to get out. And so I was like, I didn't want it to be just another book about sexual assault or sexual violence. And because it takes me so long to write a book, it had to be something that I was invested in. And so I really went back and forth, like, do I want to stay with this crime and this family? And then I decided, yes, I do, and I realized I can make this book, I wanted to add something new to the conversation. And so I did that by the way I chose to tell the story, which is starting with the opening, oh, something awful happened to Billy. And when you hear that the book is about sexual assault, and you take the vantage point of, oh, something bad happened to the guy who's being accused, it's not a very politically correct stance. And I thought, okay, well, that's where I want to go, because one of the issues that I think has come up in the last few years about telling stories about sexual assault and sexual violence and is who gets to tell the stories, and what do women, when they start telling the stories, like, how do we judge what they're saying and how they're saying it? And so I knew the book was going to be a challenge in a lot of ways, but I decided to stick with it. And so by the time you're finished, you understand that Cassie, the main character, is telling you about a crime. And what she's actually telling you about are 2 crimes, and she's the victim of one of them. But it's, telling that story takes a long way and a lot of different twists to get there.
Yeah, I have craft-related questions about how you managed all of those twists, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Have you noticed that there's this like peculiar obsession with the likability of characters? And
Yes.
did you think at all about the likability of Cassie and her family as you were writing this novel?
I live with these characters for so long that they're not unlikable to me. And it never occurs to me that anybody wouldn't like them because I know them like three-dimensionally. Like I know everything about them. And so I understand the why of how they ended up the way they ended up, that people would be like, oh my God, they're so whiny. Oh my God, she's so bitter. And it's kind of like, oh, I never even thought about that. But I do think that reading has become so much more democratic, right, in the last 15, 20 years. So you have a lot of reader sites like Goodreads and Amazon where people can tell you exactly what they think about your book and what they didn't like about it and why it didn't work. And I actually read a lot of them because I find them fascinating. Yes, no, I do. And but the idea that I write for myself, which is like I don't write for an audience. I write to figure things out and like make sense of things that make no sense to me. And so at the end, it's like, oh, I guess they are unlikable people. But I also think that if you show a character's humanity, then they become more real and a little bit more understandable, you know?
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And I think that they're understandably unlikable, which is really important. And there's a line toward the very end of the book. It's no one is all good or all bad, which is a simple line and simply phrased, but it's hard to do as a writer sometimes, right? You can get into this like minefield of archetypes. And I love how no one is inherently innocent and no one is inherently evil. Like we can root out some of these sources, but was there any particular character who was really hard to render in this particular way?
Oh yeah, the attorney.
Peter.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the reasons is because you have one vantage point, right? So you're being told everything that happens in this story is unfolding through the eyes of a 23-year-old sister. So she has an agenda. And there is an idea that unreliable narrators, they're trying to trip you up. But a lot of times an unreliable narrator doesn't know that they're unreliable. And it's only through the course of telling a story that they come to a certain awareness. And I think that is another thing that I was really trying to work with, was the idea of what you know growing up in a family implicitly versus what you understand explicitly and acknowledge. And so it's sort of a study of consciousness, right? Where you come into an understanding of yourself and your family and how you relate to each other. I mean, I think that was the bigger idea of the project as told through this story. But one of the other things I wanted to say about characters' likability or unreliability is there's also this idea that a character, oh, she's nothing like me, or I would never do that. And it's kind of like, do you remember when Sarah Palin was running for office years ago and people were like, oh my God, I love her, she's just like me. And I was like, oh, I don't want anybody in office who's just like me, right? I mean, I want someone who's not like me, who's not gonna like freeze if there's an issue, right? They're gonna solve it. And so the idea of this book is that you enter a whole other universe, right? As a writer, you're creating a world that in and of itself has its own logic, it has its own details, it has its own granularity. And I don't know that I want to read about only likable people or people that are just like me. I think the whole beauty of fiction is immersing yourself in a different world. So.
One of the things that Cassie distinguishes Cassie in my mind is that she's 23. She is incredibly smart, graduated summa from Columbia. She's getting her PhD in poli-sci at Yale. Right away when she hears about Billy, she's the loyal sister, right? She believes that her brother isn't capable of this crime. One of the things that I find most fascinating about her is that she has so much going for her, and yet she's carrying some wounds. Her last name is Quinn, but not really. She's a Forrester, but not. Can you tell me a little bit about her family of origin and how she carries them with her through her adulthood? Because I think that's really interesting.
So one of the things that I thought about when I first started, so the origins of the book were about a 6-year-old girl who was kidnapped because of her mother's negligence, and that was the original conflict of the pivot of parenting and class. And then, like I said, the courtrooms wouldn't have gone to trial, and it was too difficult for me to figure out. But Cassie is not a biological daughter of this family. And so one of the things that happened over the course of 6 years, I will write 85 drafts or however many drafts. So around draft 60, I had all of the backstory of this family all packed into one chapter, right? Because I just wanted to get it out of the way. And so it took years to get right. And then I sold the book, and my editor's like, "We love the book. You have to cut 100 pages and tell it all differently." So then I spent another 2 years rewriting it then. But the thing about Cassie is that, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, but it's in the first 30 pages, so, is that she came into this family as a very young child. And so she is sort of an outsider, but really, she's part of the family. They love her, but she feels a certain loyalty to them. And it's not about money, because she actually comes with more money than they have. Her biological father, her parents are dead, and her biological father, he owned a bank. And so she is going to come into an enormous amount of money when she turns 25. But it's always fascinated me. I have 2 stepdaughters, and I'm only realizing this now in some ways, but I have 2 stepdaughters and I have a biological daughter. And the interplay between the 3, they call themselves sisters. They're all, they're when they were first, Molly, my youngest, was first born, the older girls would say, "Oh, she's my half sister." And I'm like, "She's your sister. You don't love her half as much, right?" But it was interesting over the course of the 20 years that Molly, grew up with her 2 older sisters, watching them interact, and me as the mother feeling sort of like I had to always make things equal. Every kid had to have the same thing. And then the 2 older girls had a different mother, and they got all of the teenage angst. And they could never get angry at me because I was the hero. So I'm like, "Oh, teenage girls aren't so bad." And then Molly came, and she was a monster, right? She came up, and it hit me like a tidal wave, like, "Oh, this is what they're talking about." But I think being an outsider in her own mind, because they don't treat her like that, but she felt like that. And I think that issue she carried with her. And the other thing, too, is that the first iteration of the book with the little girl waving, there was something about her that wasn't 100%. And it took me all these years and all these drafts to understand what it was about that girl that wasn't right, And so it was almost like the book started with this image of this little girl raising her hand and the doorman watching her. And the doorman is in this book, so he carried forward. But I think writing this novel was a means of investigation. And for me, that's like figuring it out and where is she doing, why is she doing that? And then as it came together, I wrote it the way I would read it. So the reveals came to me in the same way that they would come to a reader. So then I had to back up and restart so that the pacing and all that that it worked.
So that answers a question that I was going to ask, because this book is just filled with these surprises and twists and turns that you just don't see coming, and they're incredibly satisfying. But one of the things I really wanted to know is, like, as a writer, how you keep track of them. And it sounds like you're writing into them and discovering them, and then just having
up
oh god,
and rewriting. Yeah, I know, it's so tedious, especially since I never write with outlines, ever. And it's like, when you're writing a novel, you're working on like 3 dimensions of time, because you have true lifetime. You know, you have January through December, and it has to follow 24 hours a day and all that. And then you have a character who, you know, experiences some sort of crisis, and then that has to play out in a linear fashion. Like, you can't have the character getting over it in February while at the pool, because, you know, she's going to be wearing a coat. So everything has to, I mean, I love it because it is this big puzzle that has to be solved. I mean, I love it by year 3.
Okay.
Like, the first 2 years are awful. But by 3 or 4, when you have a draft or you're working through it, then it's fun. And then it sucks again, because you got to restart the whole thing and figure it all out, especially when there's so many plot holes. So I guess by year 4, I started plotting. Like, really, you know, I really had to plot. Like, well, this is going to happen, and that's going to lead to that, and then, oh no, that, you know, and it's constantly like, I work with big calendars and stuff, and I never really did that before. But the other thing about me as a novelist, which is, you know, every writer has their own style that evolves over time. And one thing I have to say too is that all of this is in retrospect. Like, now I understand it, but as I'm doing it, I'm just like bumbling along. Like, I don't understand how I write or why I write. It's only now, because I've done it. I've written a bunch of novels that I understand my process. But I have to get 2 things before I inhabit the book, and one is dialogue. Like, until a character until they start talking, they're completely foreign to me. But once a character starts talking, then I can start to like flesh them out as a full 360, you know, real person character. And the other is the architecture of the book, because I was saying this last night. You know, my colleague Alice Munro. Alice Munro is one of the most famous, brilliant short story writers from Canada. And she was raising children, and she talked about how she could only sit for a certain amount of time, and that's why she was more inclined to short story or short fiction, because she only had a certain amount of time. So for me, because I'm writing and working at the same time, if I get the architecture down, then I can, you know, fill out all the interstitial, you know, the scenes and stuff. It's just I have to have it in my mind how it's going to work. So I got the architecture down pretty early. And then within the big, you know, 3 sections, I started, you know, really getting granular. But yeah, I mean, it was a hard book, and I didn't really expect it to be this hard, but it became very challenging for me. And that is the reason that I do it, right? I mean, because I have all of this mental energy, and it could go for the force of good, or it could go for the force of bad. And so I just happened to harness into writing when I was little, very little. And we moved a lot, so I was always new. And I had my sisters, but we were at different ages, and so I didn't really have that many friends. And I mean, we moved like 17 times by the time I was 17. And so I would always start these stories, and then I would always have something to go back to. and then they became like a place, a refuge. And then I started like building them out, but it was just my own private thing. I wasn't raised by artists or writers but when I was growing up, my parents and relatives were like, so you're going to go into journalism? And I'm like, no. And they're like, oh, you're going to go into advertising? And I'm like, no. And I'm like, I want to write stories. But it was like, it was understood that I would have to have a job. You know, the idea of writing was so foreign to anybody. And I lost my train of thought.
That's okay, because I'm going to ask you about that job now.
Okay.
Trying to be conscientious about time. So I've heard or read an interview where you talked about the fact that you have, you know, a real grown-ups job. Yeah. You're a management consultant, and you've talked about how having this day job provides both the structure as well as the stability that allows you to write. And I think that's helpful in terms of thinking about why a best-selling writer continues to have this very, you know, stressful, I imagine, and time-consuming day job. DC is like filled with would-be writers, I feel like, who would love to be able to figure out like the how. Like how do you, on a much more sort of tactical sort of way, like how does one have a serious job, have a family, have a life, and write 5 books? That's the part that's hard to convert.
I think for me, I have a lot of coworkers here. So, and I said, okay, well, here's some questions. And one is about why do you still, you know, they're like, well, we're going to ask why you continue to work.
Oh, sorry.
But, you know, the thing about a writer's life is with all my books, like my first book came out and it was made into a movie, and it really, I got a lot of offers to write either a sequel or a YA book based on it, to write the script. And I'm like, no, I'm done with that. Right. Like I did that. I don't want to be in that family anymore. I want to move on. But making that choice to not be a sequel writer or write another book very similar to it, and because that book wasn't, it didn't really start selling copies until the movie came out, and that was 5 years later. So I never really broke out in terms of big name or big sales. And as a result, I don't rely on my books to make money. And so that frees me up artistically to be able to write the kinds of books I want in the way that I want. And maybe I won't sell them, but at least I will have fixed that issue. I've figured it out, and then I can move on. But I do think that a writer's life it can be very lonely, and writers are difficult. Having writer friends is wonderful, and it also is crazy making. But I know for me that I needed the stability, and I still need it now. I couldn't imagine not having a job. It makes everything. There are certain times where the book work is going really badly, but if I can just shift and feel bad about my job, or you know what I mean. It's like you're screwing up at everything. Like I have the family thing, but I think that it gives a lot of balance. And I also didn't have kids until I was 40. I didn't get married or anything until I was much older, and so I went to graduate school, and then I spent 10 years writing and going to work, and so I sort of figured out my process before I took on the demands of a family, and I think that I was a late bloomer, and I think that was good for me too. I think everybody has to find their own rhythm, but it always is also, it comes back to the work. Like you have to do your work. And no matter how you get yourself in that chair, doing the work is what saved me, Mm-hmm. And I had some really long, lean periods of rejection. So I at least had a job so that I felt like I was moving forward, even as my whole writing career, it stalled for like 8 years, you know, like, and I know doesn't seem like a long time, but when you're writing all the time and you're trying to send stuff out and your agent's coming back with, 28 editors rejected your book that you worked on for 5 years, you're like, oh, well, I guess I'm done. I mean, I guess I'm done. I guess that's it, you know?
There's a lot to unpack there.
I know.
There really is. So wait, earlier on you said something about writing on Fridays. It doesn't sound like you're like the daily writer type.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's actually really reassuring, I think, because I teach creative writing at the undergraduate level, and I think students get all these like bits of advice and words of wisdom in their head, and they think if they're not writing every day, they're doing it wrong. But it sounds like you're taking the approach that you fit it in, how you fit it in, and in a way that works around the life that you have.
Right. One thing I do have is a limited amount of time. And so if I know that I can get back-to-back time between, 2 and 4, then I will dig in and say, you have to do this. I'm like, I can't wait for the muse. Like, I have to write when the time is available to me. But if I also know that if I don't write and it doesn't come out well, it's not the end of the world. But it's taken 30 years to have that reassurance. Even now, I'll be like, oh, I'm done. I have nothing more to say. I suck. And I think it's just, learning how to trust yourself as a writer and as a, like a literary citizen, I mean, I feel like I've been around a long time, and I've seen a lot of trends. I've seen a lot of different publishing gimmicks and stuff like that, but I always just stayed true to myself, and to do that I worked so that I was able to take on these projects that might not be as marketable, I guess.
So speaking of being in this business for a long time, I was watching you on Instagram Live, which is a bewildering format for anyone who has ever done it or watched it. I don't get it. But you were on it, and you had started to say that this was a book that felt like a departure from your last 4 books. And it was also a book that I hope I'm not misquoting you, a book that you don't think you could have written earlier on in your career. And then my internet cut out, and I didn't get to hear what you were saying. So I was wondering if you could spin off on that a little bit.
Oh, sure. Like, when I was first starting out, the idea of finishing a book was, kind of beyond me. And then the idea of, like, it would take me 25 pages to get a guy from the breakfast table out the door in the morning, right? I would say everything he did, I would document, because I didn't have an innate sense of pacing. And then it would also be like my scenes would run on forever, because the idea of shifting time and moving forward, I could read it and I could understand it, but I didn't have that innate sense of how stories flowed. And then over time it became, each novel became sort of a learning experience, where my first novel was about a family. It was a first-person narrator. My second novel took on more characters. But, each project became more complex and ambitious. And I think this one, because when you get to the end, you realize it's a very different book than what you were reading, I was essentially writing 2 books at the same time. And that took a level of artistry that, when I was first starting out, and with my 25 pages or a guy getting on a plane, right? He puts down the tray table. Like, we've all been on planes. Like, we get it. But I was also so insecure that I didn't trust that a reader, a reader would be able to glean from what I'm saying that he was on a plane. And you know what I mean? Like, I had to spell it out for you. And so it took all these different novels and all these years of understanding where my strengths are and my weaknesses. And this was really twisty, and I've never written a thriller, because it's kind of a thriller, even though it's a family drama. But the other thing I was going to say about that is you reach, like, I understand how books are put together now. And when I went to graduate school, I really didn't understand the mechanics of novels. And I went to graduate school, and I didn't really walk out a better writer, but I walked out a better reader. And so I learned how to deconstruct books from a mechanical point of view. Like, why did you open the scene that way? Or why did, you know, and so I became a critical reader. And because I remember my thesis advisor was Mona Simpson. And she's like, oh my God, you've got to learn how to edit yourself. And I'm like, oh, okay. You know, and she's like, she showed me, you know, this is how you read critically. And now it's hard to turn off sometimes when I'm reading, because I can say, oh, you know what, I would have cut the first 30 pages. Or, oh no, this is your narrator. You know what I mean? But I think that this book, it allowed me to play a little bit more than I would have certainly in the past, because I just couldn't believe I could do it, you know.
I'm going to ask one more question, because you talking about a former teacher got me onto something, and then we're going to switch over to questions from all of you. I have so many students who want to write about really complicated, difficult topics, racism, misogyny, sexual assault. And I'm actually thinking now about a student who had a short story that she needed to write involving sexual assault and issues of consent, very much like some of the themes of your book. But she was so afraid and so doubtful. And I'm wondering if you experienced that kind of tension within yourself as you were writing this book, and if so, how you worked through it, and or what kind of advice you might have for someone who's working through it themselves.
I think one of the things that I always have all kinds of tension, and it's only when I'm inside the story that I feel that the tensions lift. Like, for me, it's always going back to the work. It's just going back to the story, figuring it out, and figuring it out for the people in the story as opposed to myself. Like, if I said when I was starting this book, if I said to myself, I am taking on the issue of sexual consent, I could have never written that book, right?
Right, that's a wall too high to climb.
Right. But what I have always been fascinated by is small, very closed communities, like prisons or football teams, fraternities and sororities. They have their own language. I just love reading about all of that. And so I thought of this, well, I don't know. I mean, I know about the wealthy only from what I've seen, but I'm going to write about them, like the Murdochs of the world. And learning about that made me realize, like, oh, I'm just writing about a very wealthy family. And it didn't have that same daunting, you know, the sexual assault was a part of this family, but and an issue that they had to grapple with. But really, I wanted to study the relationships first, because that's my, you know, that's what I'm good at, and that's what I enjoy. And I think when you have that impulse to write, and I truly think that it is one of the best places to work out my own issues. I think you have to learn to trust yourself. And I tell myself that this story is just for me, that no one else is ever going to read it. And that, you know, the idea of writing for a public, for the public, that never even crosses my mind, ever. Because that would just shut me down immediately, you know? Like, taking on issues like of such, you know, like the big questions, those come out through the telling of the story. I don't, you know, I think that students, I actually taught one semester when I was an MFA student, and it was amazing how younger writers are so quick to edit themselves. And I say, you know what, don't edit yourself. Just get it down, get it out, and you can always shape it. But if you go in trying to shape it first, then you kind of back yourself into a corner, you know? Yeah.
We've we've gone over our time. I still have so many more questions, but you know what? We're going to give someone else a shot. For the benefit of people who are in the digital audience, we're going to ask folks to come up to use the microphone. Otherwise, we will not be able to pick up your question. So there's a hand up there, and if you wouldn't mind using the microphone over to the side, that would be great. Thank you. Yes, please.
My mother was a great patron of this place, and she passed away about 3 years and 4 months ago. But she was always at the mic, and for the old folks, they know exactly who she is. And it's just me now. So she's looking down on me, I'm sure, from heaven, and she's glad that I'm coming to the mic. She's my girl. All right. You talked about the importance of your characters having their voice. And then my question was already posed, but then you went on to say that you tap into sort of, you're interested in small communities, these little enclaves and football teams, fraternities, they have their lingo, dialect, code ways of communicating and things. How do you deal with, when you write your characters, how do you handle accents and dialects and things like that of ethnic communities? How do you approach that in your writing?
Well, I read a lot.
Okay.
And I don't take on characters that I don't feel I could learn enough about to write about.
Okay.
So for instance, in my last book, I had a very close narrator. That he was a character, and he was black.
Okay.
And I was really looking at his interior life, and that was a challenge that I took on for myself, and I did it by reading and figuring out what made this character fully a 360 living, breathing individual. And I do my best. I do my research, and and sometimes I just take a leap of faith.
Have you been able to travel to different parts of the country? I went to Howard University. I have a degree in English, so I read better than everyone I know. They tease me about that. But I understood what you meant about deconstructing a book and knowing the publisher, it's innuendo, and I get it. I studied it for 4 years. I have a degree in it. Okay, so I'm certified, right? Certified in reading. But there was a film that we watched in school called American Tongues, and it was about different dialects and things that were in different parts that America that where you say one thing one way in a certain dialect or accent, and then it means something else on the other side of the country. So I just wondered if if you included any of that in parts of your book with your characters.
Book, no. This one I didn't.
Okay.
But in my last book, yes. I mean, I traveled a lot, and
language is. I'm glad you're covering it, that you're interested in it.
Yeah, I am. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. For
Good
your
luck
question.
to you.
Thank
God
you
bless.
so much. And I love that you stood up and told us about your mom. And
I'm glad you're here. She's
glad
glad
you're
I'm here. All right, so
thank you so much.
no ghost, y'all. I'm not from Louisiana, but I feel like it. But
Okay.
bless the lady. So
Thank you.
yeah. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have two questions. You spoke about how many drafts you write in such a cheerful way. But do you ever have, and you said now you can kind of see your process. So my first question is, do you ever have a point where you think you need to give up a book, have given up a book? What's the difference? And then my second question is, when you were writing this book, were there any books that you read that you sort of thought like fit in the same family, or like you were kind of reading for research?
Yes, thank you for your questions. So one of the issues that came up was this trial. And I'm not a lawyer, and I don't even know why I wanted to write the trial. So I knew that I couldn't. So I spent 18 months avoiding it. Like I set the book 20 years in the future so they could refer to the trial, or I actually downgraded the crime from a felony to a misdemeanor so they could just hash it out, in conversation. And then the other thing I did was I had them settle so they didn't have to, And finally my friend said, just write it. And I'm like, I can't. And that's when I've always loved courtroom thrillers, always. But I never really studied them the way that I did for this book, which is to say, how did this open? Why did this start here? What happened? And it became its own learning experience, which is like a courtroom is sort of like a play or a trial, right? So there's and it's actually very satisfying because there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I read everything you can imagine about different kinds of books that used courtroom scenes and how they did it. And it was so enlightening to me. And my sister is an attorney, so she read chapters, and she's like, you can't do that. And I'm like, well, show me how I can back into it. How can I back into it? And there were many points where I'm like, this is too much for me. I can't, it's not satisfying. When a book makes me so unhappy that I just dread it, I will continue to write it until I am just depleted. And I only give up when it goes out into the world and it doesn't sell. And I think that is a learning lesson, though, because not all projects work. And I think, sometimes I really have to stop being so hard on myself. Like if a project isn't working, it's not working. It's just, for me, when you invest so many years, because most fiction, or my fiction, isn't sold until the book is done. And so that's a really big investment of time and energy. And now I have an agent that I work with, and she really understands my process, and we work together. And she also talks about the marketing of it and what I want to accomplish with it. And that helps me stay on track and not take on projects that are destined to fail. So, thank you.
Hi, Jillian.
Hi.
I loved your book.
Thank you.
And I couldn't put it down, which brings me to my question, when's the next book?
Oh. So publishing is a pretty slow process. So I actually wrote this book faster than I normally do because of the pandemic. I had a lot of commuting time that I would have normally traveled to the office, so I was able to get some back-to-back hours. Excuse me. So I actually sold this book in 2020, and there's some really big downtime between you selling your book, you're getting your edits, and I'm like, I have to have something to think about. Mm-hmm. And so I started a new book, and it's completely different from this. It's about the origins of dialysis machines, and it's called The Committee, and it's about medical ethics, and it's set in 1960. Because I'm like, there's no way I want to write about cell phones and technology. You know what I mean? Like, I just can't do it. I have to get away from that. But I also have the architecture of the book. So I know how it's going to play out. So I'm sort of starting this one in a completely different place. Mm-hmm. And I guess we'll talk again in 4 years.
Great.
Thank you.
Hi, Jillian.
Hi.
I have a question. It's kind of big. So what informed your approach to the wealthy? Like, how did you research that? And then when you research, do you have to, because you had to tackle a lot of issues,
Right.
and you said it yourself, the wealthy and family and adoption and, you know, all this. So, like, how do you research one thing at a time? Are you reading, like,
I read,
all
I
these
think it's like
different things? And
Jennifer's question, where it's kind of like, oh, I'll read similar things in the same family, but that aren't so close, or that aren't even like more. I'll try to read, to be honest, more commercial stuff, that because one thing that happens when I read, you know, literary fiction as I'm writing, is if it's really good, I'll just start like adopting the voice. You know what I mean? And I don't want to do that. Like I want to. So what I do is I read a lot of nonfiction. That like I read for this particular book. I read a lot about Wall Street. Like one of my favorite books is Liar's Poker, and just, you know, the way that money is used. Just it's not even about, it's like currency, but it's also, there's a certain, you know, the whole alpha male kind of thing, and how that trickles down within a family. Like I studied it more for the details. And the thing about commercial fiction is it moves so fast, and you know, not all commercial fiction, and every genre now there's hybrids and stuff, but I tried to pull from these books what would help me in this one, you know. And I don't know, I think reading nonfiction is now the way that I've been able to avoid you know, co-opting things that I don't want to take on.
do films influence you too?
Oh my God, yes. Like everything from Succession to Billions, like all that stuff. And I don't even know how much of it is true, but it's true to me. Like I believe it. You know, I think the weird thing about being a novelist too, for me, is that I believe everything. Like if you tell me something, why wouldn't it not be true? So I tend to be a sponge for a lot of things. And then if I put it in the book, then I'll have to like double check on Wikipedia. But you know, the internet has made my job a lot easier, I will say, even though technology is very difficult to keep up to date with. But as being a novelist, it's very easy to find research. I mean, there are unbelievable amount of blogs about luxury watches and luxury cars. And they get into like the deep dive into why one watch is better than the other. And so what I'll do is like I'll take a few key phrases, or, you know, I remember this ad, Grace, Pace, and Space was for a BMW or something like that. And I'm like, oh, I love that. But it didn't make it into, you know, it was eventually cut. But just like when you have these phrases, then I kind of work around it and blow them out into actual details. So.
Thank you.
So I'm going to end with one last question. Okay. You had two really great pieces online today. One was in crime reads. So for anyone who is interested in other books in the crime fiction genre that Jillian read, that was today, right? Yes. And the other piece, which I absolutely loved, was in Lit Hub, which was about breaking up with your first agent. We coincidentally share the same agent, and we love her. It wasn't written in the form of advice, but I imagine that there's some writer out there who's kind of looking for an agent or in the throes of breaking up with their own agent who it's useful advice for. I don't know. I just think... I'm always curious, like, what advice a writer who has several books under their belt would give to their younger self starting out. So what would Jillian at book 5 say to Jillian in the metaverse at book 1?
You know, if I could just shake that girl until her eyes rolled back in her head and say, just trust yourself. This is something you can do. Just do it. And don't get sidetracked. I mean, one of the things that happened with my first agent was I started writing for her because she was so strong a personality and so skilled and a lawyer. And I started writing things that made her like me. And I just wanted her to like me. And she did like me. She loved me. But it was also a business relationship. And so I think it's more just learning to trust my instincts. I think I would have wasted a lot less time, you know? So.
Awesome.
Yep, thank
Congratulations,
you. Oh,
Jillian.
thank you.
It's a brilliant book. Don't read it right before bed. The chapters are very short, and you'll keep telling yourself, like, just one more, and then you will be sleepless like I was trying to finish it. But it's brilliant.
Thank you.
Congrats.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.